Abstract. The accelerating integration of artificial intelligence into workplace operations has precipitated widespread workforce reductions across industries, raising urgent questions about the future of employment. This article examines the emerging phenomenon of AI-justified layoffs and argues that these decisions are driven less by technological capability than by managerial short-termism and misaligned executive incentive structures. Drawing on labor economics, organizational behavior theory, and historical precedent, this analysis demonstrates that current corporate responses to AI adoption risk creating a self-undermining cycle. Firms reduce labor costs to boost short-term profits while simultaneously eroding the consumer demand upon which those profits depend. The article proposes work time reduction, specifically, a gradual decrease in the standard workweek, as a pragmatic policy intervention to prevent AI-driven mass unemployment. By adjusting labor supply in response to declining labor demand, governments can preserve employment, maintain consumer purchasing power, and ensure that productivity gains from automation translate into broadly shared prosperity rather than concentrated wealth and widespread precarity. Historical analysis of previous workweek reductions, from the 6-day to the 5-day week, provides evidence that such transitions are both feasible and economically beneficial. The article concludes with policy recommendations for implementing graduated workweek reductions, including tax incentives, regulatory frameworks, and conditions attached to AI-related subsidies. This approach reframes reduced working hours not as a luxury or lifestyle preference but as essential economic infrastructure for an AI-transformed labor market. Keywords artificial intelligence, labor displacement, workweek reduction, short-termism, technological unemployment, economic stabilization, automation policy. Introduction. The integration of artificial intelligence into productive processes has entered a new phase of acceleration, marked by rapid deployment of generative AI tools, large language models, and automated decision-making systems across virtually every sector of the economy. Over the past year, announcements of layoffs explicitly tied to artificial intelligence have become a near-weekly occurrence, with companies across industries citing efficiency gains from AI tools as justification for workforce reductions. Acemoglu and Restrepo, 2020. Technology firms, financial institutions, media organizations, and manufacturing companies have all invoked AI capabilities as rationale for downsizing, creating what appears to be the early stages of a profound restructuring of labor markets. The phenomenon presents a striking paradox. Contemporary AI systems, despite their impressive capabilities, remain fundamentally limited in their ability to fully replicate human cognitive labor. Large language models produce confident but often inaccurate outputs, struggle with novel situations, and lack the contextual judgment that experienced workers provide. Bender et al. 2021. Computer vision systems fail in edge cases. Automated decision-making tools embed and amplify biases from their training data. Yet despite these well-documented limitations, companies are proceeding with workforce reductions as though comprehensive automation were already achieved. Computer science graduates, once among the most secure entrants into the labor market, increasingly struggle to find opportunities as entry-level roles face automation or elimination. Orta, 2015. This disconnect between AI capability and corporate behavior raises a fundamental question. If artificial intelligence cannot yet fully replace human labor, why are so many companies acting as though it already can? The answer, this article argues, lies less in technological determinism than in the incentive structures governing corporate decision-making. After decades of intensifying short-termism in corporate governance, firms have invested heavily in AI technologies and face enormous pressure to demonstrate rapid returns on those investments, even when doing so compromises long-term organizational stability and broader economic health. Lazanick and DeSullivan, 2000. This article examines the dynamics driving AI-justified workforce reductions and proposes a policy framework centered on work time reduction as a mechanism for preventing AI-driven mass unemployment. The analysis proceeds in several stages. First, it examines the role of managerial short-termism in shaping corporate responses to AI adoption, demonstrating how executive compensation structures and quarterly reporting pressures create incentives for premature workforce reductions. Second, it analyzes the self-undermining logic of labor displacement in a consumer economy, showing how widespread automation without corresponding adjustments threatens the demand conditions upon which corporate profits depend. Third, it surveys historical precedents for workweek reduction, demonstrating that such adjustments have successfully accompanied previous waves of technological change. Fourth, it develops a policy framework for gradually reducing the standard workweek as AI capabilities advance, including specific mechanisms for implementation. Finally, it addresses potential objections and implementation challenges, arguing that proactive policy intervention represents a more prudent course than reactive crisis management. The central argument is that work time reduction should be understood not as a utopian aspiration or lifestyle preference but as essential economic infrastructure for managing technological transition. If artificial intelligence substantially reduces the need for human labor in aggregate, the sustainable path to preserving employment, consumer demand, and social stability requires adjusting labor supply through reduced working hours. This approach allows society to capture the productivity benefits of AI while distributing those gains broadly rather than concentrating them among capital owners while workers bear the costs of displacement. #The architecture of short-termism, executive incentives and AI-driven layoffs. #Structural foundations of corporate short-termism. Understanding the current wave of AI-justified layoffs requires examining the incentive structures that shape executive decision-making in contemporary corporations. Over the past 4 decades, corporate governance has undergone a fundamental transformation characterized by the ascendance of shareholder value maximization as the dominant paradigm guiding managerial behavior, Olazanik and O'Sullivan, 2000. This transformation has been accompanied by corresponding changes in executive compensation, with an increasing proportion of managerial remuneration tied to stock price performance through equity grants, stock options, and performance bonuses linked to share appreciation. The consequences of this compensation structure for corporate decision-making have been extensively documented. When executive wealth depends primarily on stock price movements, managers face powerful incentives to prioritize actions that boost share prices in the short term, even when such actions may compromise long-term organizational health or broader stakeholder interests. Edmonds et al. 2017. Quarterly earnings reports become focal points for managerial attention, with decisions evaluated primarily through the lens of their impact on near-term financial metrics rather than their long-term strategic implications. This short-term orientation manifests across numerous dimensions of corporate behavior. Research has demonstrated that firms facing pressure to meet quarterly earnings targets systematically reduce research and development expenditures, defer maintenance investments, and engage in earnings management practices that sacrifice future performance for present appearances. Graham et al. 2005. The phenomenon extends to employment decisions, with studies finding that firms facing short-term financial pressure are more likely to engage in workforce reductions even when such cuts may impair future productive capacity. Jung, 2015. #AI investment and the pressure for returns. The dynamics of short-termism take on particular significance in the context of AI adoption. Over the past several years, corporations have invested enormous sums in artificial intelligence capabilities, acquiring AI startups, licensing large language models, building internal data science teams, and deploying automated systems across operations. These investments have been justified to shareholders and boards on the basis of anticipated productivity gains, cost reductions, and competitive advantages. Having made such substantial commitments, executives face intense pressure to demonstrate returns on those investments, and to do so quickly. This pressure creates incentives for what might be termed performative automation workforce reductions that demonstrate AI-related cost savings to investors regardless of whether the underlying technology is truly capable of replacing the displaced workers. When a company announces layoffs attributed to AI efficiency gains, the announcement itself signals to financial markets that the firm is successfully extracting value from its technology investments. Stock prices may rise in response, validating the decision within the logic of shareholder value maximization, even if the operational reality is considerably more complex. The pattern has become visible across sectors. Technology companies have announced substantial layoffs while simultaneously claiming that AI tools enable remaining workers to accomplish more. Financial services firms have reduced headcount in areas such as research analysis and customer service, attributing the changes to AI capabilities. Media organizations have eliminated positions in content production, editing, and fact-checking on the grounds that AI can perform these functions. In each case, the framing emphasizes AI as the driver of efficiency, positioning workforce reductions as natural responses to technological progress rather than discretionary managerial choices. ###The reality behind efficiency claims. Empirical examination of these AI-justified layoffs often reveals a more complicated picture than the official narratives suggest. While AI tools may indeed enhance productivity in specific tasks, they frequently introduce new sources of error, require substantial human oversight, and struggle with the contextual judgment that experienced workers provide. The result is often not genuine labor substitution but rather work intensification for remaining employees, who must compensate for AI limitations while managing increased workloads. Accounts from workers affected by these dynamics illuminate the gap between corporate claims and operational reality. In technology companies that have deployed AI coding assistants while reducing engineering headcount, remaining developers report spending substantial time correcting AI-generated errors, debugging code that appears functional but contains subtle flaws, and maintaining systems that have become more brittle due to automation. Rather than reducing total labor requirements, the AI deployment has shifted the composition of work while expecting fewer workers to manage expanded responsibilities. This pattern suggests that many AI-justified layoffs represent premature workforce reductions driven by financial pressures rather than genuine technological substitution. Companies are, in effect, borrowing against future AI capabilities that may or may not materialize, reducing headcount in anticipation of automation that remains incomplete. The strategy allows executives to claim early success from AI investments while externalizing the costs of that incompleteness onto remaining workers through extended hours and intensified effort. #Implications for organizational stability. The consequences of premature AI-driven workforce reductions extend beyond immediate work intensification. Organizations that shed experienced workers in pursuit of short-term efficiency gains risk losing institutional knowledge that proves difficult to replace. Complex systems require not only the ability to perform routine operations but also deep understanding of edge cases, historical context, and the tacit knowledge that experienced workers accumulate over years of practice. Ononaka and Takeuchi, 1995. Some analysts have suggested that major technology failures in recent years may be partially attributable to the loss of experienced personnel, as organizations have prioritized cost reduction over the maintenance of robust operational capacity. When systems fail, the absence of workers who understood their intricacies becomes suddenly apparent. The efficiency gains recorded in quarterly reports may prove illusory when evaluated against the costs of degraded reliability and lost capability. This dynamic illustrates a broader principle: the metrics that drive short-term decision-making often fail to capture the full costs of those decisions. Workforce reductions appear beneficial when evaluated solely through the lens of labor costs and immediate productivity measures. The long-term consequences, degraded knowledge, increased fragility, reduced adaptive capacity, materialize gradually and may not be traceable to the original decisions that caused them. #The self-undermining logic of labor displacement. #The paradox of productivity and demand. The dynamics described above represent more than organizational dysfunction. They point toward a fundamental contradiction in the logic of AI-driven labor displacement. At the level of the individual firm, replacing human labor with AI systems can appear economically rational. Labor represents a substantial cost, and if technology can perform equivalent work at lower expense, substitution seems to offer straightforward efficiency gains. Yet this calculus, applied across the economy as a whole, generates aggregate outcomes that undermine the conditions for its own success. The contradiction is essentially Keynesian in structure. In a consumer economy, the wages paid to workers constitute not only costs to employers but also the source of demand for the goods and services those employers produce. When firms across the economy simultaneously reduce labor costs by displacing workers with automation, they collectively erode the purchasing power that sustains consumer demand. Keynes, 1936. The efficiency gains captured by individual firms translate into reduced aggregate spending, weakened sales, and ultimately lower profits than would have prevailed under conditions of fuller employment. This dynamic has been characterized as a fallacy of composition. What appears rational for each individual actor becomes irrational when aggregated across all actors. Each firm that replaces workers with AI may boost its own margins in the short term. But if all firms pursue this strategy simultaneously, the result is a contraction of the consumer market that supports corporate revenues. The strategy succeeds only insofar as it is not universally adopted, a condition that competitive pressures make impossible to sustain. Historical precedents and theoretical foundations. The concern that technological unemployment might generate self-undermining dynamics is not new to the AI era. Similar anxieties accompanied previous waves of automation, from the mechanization of agriculture to the computerization of manufacturing and services. In each case, societies faced the challenge of ensuring that productivity gains translated into broadly shared prosperity rather than concentrated wealth and widespread displacement. Economic historians have documented the mechanisms through which earlier technological transitions avoided catastrophic unemployment outcomes. Central among these was the expansion of new sectors and occupations that absorbed workers displaced from automating industries, combined with institutional arrangements, including labor unions, minimum wage laws, and social insurance programs, that maintained worker bargaining power and consumer demand. Gordon, 2016. The transition was not automatic or painless, but the combination of new employment opportunities and redistributive institutions prevented technological progress from generating permanent mass unemployment. The question confronting contemporary societies is whether similar mechanisms will operate in the context of AI-driven automation. Several features of the current moment suggest grounds for concern. First, AI represents a general-purpose technology with potential applications across virtually all cognitive tasks, limiting the availability of new sectors to which displaced workers might migrate. Brynjolfsson and McAfee, 2014. Second, the pace of technological change may exceed the pace at which labor markets can adjust, creating protracted periods of displacement and dislocation. Third, the institutional frameworks that facilitated earlier transitions, particularly labor unions and robust social insurance, have weakened substantially in recent decades, leaving workers with reduced capacity to claim shares of productivity gains. The temporal mismatch problem. A crucial dimension of the self-undermining dynamic involves temporal mismatch between individual firm decisions and aggregate economic consequences. When an executive decides to replace workers with AI systems, the benefits, reduced labor costs, improved margins, higher stock prices, materialize immediately and are attributable to the decision maker. The costs, reduced consumer demand, weakened sales across the economy, emerge gradually, diffusely, and cannot be traced to any particular decision or actor. This temporal structure creates profound incentive misalignment. Executives whose performance is evaluated quarterly have little reason to weigh consequences that materialize over years or decades. If aggressive automation generates short-term gains that satisfy shareholders and boards, the strategy will appear successful within the time frame relevant to executive evaluation. By the time aggregate demand effects become apparent, the executives who made the decisions may have moved to other positions, retired, or been replaced for reasons unrelated to the consequences of earlier choices. The result is a collective action problem of considerable severity. Each firm faces incentives to automate aggressively, externalizing the demand-side consequences onto the economy as a whole. No individual firm can solve the problem unilaterally, since a company that refrains from automation while competitors proceed will sacrifice competitive position without meaningfully preserving aggregate demand. The logic of competition drives all firms toward strategies that, in aggregate, undermine the conditions for their collective success. Corporate predictions and corporate behavior. A revealing manifestation of this dynamic appears in the gap between executive predictions about AI and work and executive actions within their own organizations. Many corporate leaders have publicly suggested that artificial intelligence will enable shorter workweeks, improved work-life balance, and reduced working hours for employees. These predictions acknowledge that AI productivity gains could, in principle, be translated into reduced labor time rather than reduced labor force. Yet the same executives who make these predictions show no inclination to implement shorter workweeks within their own organizations. The disconnect is not hypocritical in any simple sense, it reflects the incentive structures within which executives operate. Reducing working hours without proportionally reducing compensation would increase per-hour labor costs, reducing short-term profitability and potentially lowering stock prices. No matter how beneficial such a policy might be for workers, for consumer demand, or for long-term economic stability, it offers no advantage within the quarterly reporting framework that governs executive evaluation. This gap between prediction and action illustrates why market mechanisms alone cannot be expected to solve the problem of AI-driven labor displacement. Even when executives recognize that shorter workweeks represent a desirable outcome of technological progress, they lack incentives to implement such policies unilaterally. The transition requires coordination that market competition cannot provide, coordination that must come from public policy. #Historical precedent. The evolution of working time. The long decline in working hours. Contemporary discussions of workweek reduction often treat the idea as novel or utopian, overlooking the substantial historical precedent for such adjustments. Over the past 2 centuries, advanced economies have experienced dramatic reductions in standard working time, from workweeks exceeding 60 hours in the early industrial period to the 40-hour standard that became normative in the 20th century. This historical trajectory demonstrates that workweek reduction is not merely feasible but has been a consistent feature of economic development. Huberman and Mins, 2007. The mechanisms driving historical reductions in working time were various. Labor movements advocated for shorter hours as a matter of worker welfare and dignity, organizing strikes and political campaigns around demands for the 8-hour day. Employers in some contexts recognized that reduced hours could improve productivity by reducing fatigue and increasing worker engagement. Governments intervened through legislation establishing maximum hours, overtime regulations, and eventually the 40-hour standard week. The transition from 6-day to 5-day workweeks provides particularly instructive precedent. In the early 20th century, most workers were expected to labor 6 days per week, with only Sunday reserved for rest. The 5-day week emerged gradually through a combination of labor advocacy, employer experimentation, and eventually legal codification. Henry Ford's adoption of the 5-day week at Ford Motor Company in 1926 is often cited as a landmark moment, though the decision reflected Ford's broader philosophy about worker purchasing power as much as pure efficiency considerations. Economic effects of historical workweek reductions. Contrary to predictions that reduced working hours would undermine economic performance, historical evidence suggests that workweek reductions have generally been compatible with, and may have contributed to, sustained economic growth. Studies of the transition to the 40-hour week find that productivity per hour worked increased substantially, partially offsetting the reduction in total hours. Golden, 2012. Workers who are less fatigued and have more time for rest and recovery perform more effectively during working hours, a dynamic that becomes increasingly important as work involves more cognitive rather than purely physical tasks. Moreover, reduced working hours contributed to the expansion of consumer demand that supported mass production economies. Workers with more leisure time developed new consumption patterns, travel, entertainment, hobbies, that created demand for goods and services beyond basic necessities. The weekend itself became an economic institution, generating entire industries oriented around leisure and recreation. Far from representing a drain on economic activity, reduced working time helped constitute the consumer economy that characterized 20th century prosperity. The historical record also demonstrates that predictions of economic catastrophe accompanying workweek reductions consistently failed to materialize. Opponents of the 8-hour day warned that shortened hours would render firms uncompetitive, drive companies out of business, and ultimately harm the workers the policy was intended to help. Similar arguments accompanied proposals for the 40-hour week and continue to be voiced against contemporary proposals for further reductions. Yet each reduction was successfully absorbed, often more smoothly than critics anticipated. Lessons for the AI transition. Historical precedent offers several lessons for contemporary policy regarding AI and working time. First, workweek reduction has been a recurring mechanism for managing technological transitions, allowing productivity gains to translate into reduced labor time rather than reduced employment. The logic that governed earlier transitions, if less labor is needed in aggregate, the sustainable response is to reduce hours per worker rather than eliminate workers, applies with equal force to AI-driven automation. Second, the transitions were not automatic market outcomes but required deliberate intervention through labor organizing, employer policy, and government regulation. Left to market mechanisms alone, firms faced incentives to extract maximum hours from workers rather than reduce working time. The historical reductions required coordination across firms to prevent competitive dynamics from undermining individual initiatives. This coordination came ultimately from public policy establishing new standards applicable to all employers. Third, the transitions occurred gradually rather than through sudden shifts. The move from 60-hour weeks to 40-hour weeks took decades, allowing firms and workers to adjust incrementally. Any policy framework for AI-era workweek reduction should similarly anticipate gradual transition, with standards adjusted over time as AI capabilities develop and labor displacement proceeds. Fourth, the transitions were accompanied by institutional supports that maintained worker bargaining power and prevented wages from falling proportionally with hours. Without such supports, reduced hours would have meant reduced incomes, undermining the demand-side benefits of the policy. Contemporary workweek reduction similarly requires attention to income maintenance, ensuring that shorter hours translate into shared prosperity rather than worker impoverishment. #A policy framework for work time reduction. #The case for public policy intervention. The analysis developed in preceding sections points toward a clear conclusion. Market mechanisms alone cannot be expected to generate workweek reduction in response to AI-driven productivity gains. Individual firms lack incentives to reduce hours unilaterally, since doing so would increase per-hour costs while competitors continued extracting maximum hours. Even executives who recognize the desirability of shorter workweeks in principle face quarterly pressures that preclude implementation. Collective action problems prevent coordinated private sector solutions. This market failure creates a clear rationale for public policy intervention. If workweek reduction represents the sustainable path to preserving employment as AI reduces labor demand, and if market mechanisms cannot generate such reduction, then government action becomes necessary to achieve outcomes that markets cannot produce. The intervention is not a matter of overriding market efficiency but of addressing a genuine market failure rooted in collective action problems and externalities. The policy case is strengthened by the distributional stakes involved. Without intervention, the gains from AI-driven productivity will flow predominantly to capital owners and highly compensated workers who retain employment, while displaced workers bear the costs of technological transition. Workweek reduction offers a mechanism for distributing productivity gains broadly, ensuring that technological progress benefits society as a whole rather than exacerbating inequality. Graduated reduction of standard hours. The centerpiece of an effective policy framework should be graduated reduction of the standard workweek as AI capabilities advance. Rather than attempting a sudden shift from 40 hours to a substantially shorter week, policy should establish a trajectory of incremental reductions, from 40 hours to 36, then to 32, and potentially beyond as warranted by technological developments. This graduated approach allows firms and workers to adjust incrementally, reducing disruption while establishing clear expectations about the direction of change. The specific timing and magnitude of reductions should be informed by ongoing assessment of AI deployment and labor market conditions. Policy mechanisms might include statutory reduction of standard hours legislation establishing new thresholds for the standard workweek, with overtime provisions applying to hours beyond the reduced standard. This approach mirrors the historical mechanism through which the 40-hour week was established and provides clear, universal standards applicable to all employers. Sector-specific standards recognition that AI adoption and its labor market effects vary across industries, with some sectors experiencing more rapid displacement than others. Regulatory frameworks might allow for sector-specific working time standards that reflect differential automation trajectories. Trigger mechanisms policy provisions that automatically adjust working time standards in response to specified labor market indicators, such as unemployment rates, labor force participation, or measures of AI deployment. Such mechanisms would allow policy to respond dynamically to changing conditions without requiring new legislation for each adjustment. Transition periods reasonable timeframes for implementation, allowing firms to adjust operations, restructure workflows, and make necessary technological investments. Historical precedent suggests that firms are more capable of adapting to changed working time standards than they typically predict. Maintaining income through the transition. A critical element of effective workweek reduction policy involves maintaining worker incomes as hours decrease. If reduced hours translate proportionally into reduced wages, the demand-side benefits of the policy would be substantially undermined, and workers would bear the costs of a transition whose benefits accrue primarily to employers. Successful workweek reduction requires mechanisms for ensuring that productivity gains are shared. Several policy tools can support income maintenance. Minimum wage adjustments. Recalibrating minimum wages to reflect reduced working hours, ensuring that hourly compensation increases proportionally. This approach preserves total earnings for workers at or near the minimum wage while establishing a floor that influences wages throughout the distribution. Tax policy. Using tax incentives to encourage employers to maintain compensation as hours decrease. Payroll tax reductions, tax credits for firms that reduce hours without proportional wage cuts, or other mechanisms could shift employer incentives toward maintaining worker incomes. Strengthened collective bargaining. Labor unions have historically been instrumental in securing reduced working hours alongside maintained or improved wages. Policy measures that strengthen worker collective bargaining rights, including sectoral bargaining, card check recognition, and enhanced protections against employer interference, would provide workers with institutional capacity to negotiate favorable terms. Social insurance expansion. Complementary policies that reduce worker dependence on wages for essential needs, including healthcare, childcare, housing assistance, and retirement security, lower the stakes of any transition effects and provide additional support for workers navigating changed employment conditions. Incentivizing employer compliance. Beyond establishing new working time standards, effective policy requires incentive structures that encourage employer compliance and discourage evasion. Historical experience with labor standards demonstrates that statutory requirements alone may be insufficient without robust enforcement and positive incentives for compliance. Potential mechanisms include tax incentives for work sharing. Existing work-sharing programs in some jurisdictions provide unemployment insurance support for firms that reduce hours rather than laying off workers during economic downturns. These programs could be expanded and adapted to encourage permanent hour reductions in response to AI-driven productivity gains. Procurement preferences. Governments command substantial purchasing power through public procurement. Conditioning access to government contracts on compliance with working time standards and employment practices creates meaningful incentives for firms that depend on public sector business. Conditions on AI subsidies. Many governments are investing heavily in AI development through research funding, tax credits, and direct subsidies. Attaching employment conditions to these benefits, including requirements for workforce transition planning and compliance with working time standards, ensures that public support for AI does not facilitate worker displacement. Enhanced enforcement. Strengthening labor standards enforcement capacity, including resources for investigation, meaningful penalties for violations, and protections for worker reporting, ensures that established standards translate into actual workplace practices. International coordination. The global nature of economic competition creates potential complications for unilateral workweek reduction. Firms in jurisdictions with shorter hours might face competitive disadvantages relative to those in jurisdictions allowing longer hours, potentially motivating capital flight or creating pressure for policy reversal. While these concerns are often overstated, historical evidence suggests that working time reductions have generally not undermined national competitiveness. Attention to international coordination can strengthen policy effectiveness. Potential approaches include trade policy integration. Incorporating working time standards into trade agreements, such that market access privileges are conditioned on compliance with minimum standards. This approach aligns trade incentives with labor policy objectives. International standard setting. Pursuing working time standards through international labor organizations, building toward harmonized norms across major economies. While such processes are slow, they can establish aspirational frameworks that guide national policy development. Border adjustments. Policies that impose fees on imports from jurisdictions with substantially lower labor standards, offsetting competitive advantages derived from worker exploitation. While administratively complex, such mechanisms can protect against regulatory arbitrage. Anticipating objections and implementation challenges. Economic feasibility concerns. Critics of workweek reduction typically raise concerns about economic feasibility, arguing that reduced hours will increase costs, undermine competitiveness, and reduce economic output. These concerns warrant serious consideration, though historical evidence and theoretical analysis suggest they are less formidable than often presented. The claim that reduced hours necessarily increase costs assumes that output per hour will remain constant as hours decrease. Substantial evidence contradicts this assumption. Studies consistently find that productivity per hour increases as working hours decrease, at least within the range of reductions contemplated in most proposals, Pencavel, 2015. Workers who are less fatigued, more rested, and have more time for recovery perform more effectively during working hours. The relationship is particularly strong for cognitive work, which dominates contemporary employment in advanced economies. Moreover, cost calculations that focus solely on labor expenses ignore the demand side effects that workweek reduction can generate. If reduced hours are implemented with income maintenance, consumer spending power is preserved while employment is distributed more broadly. The resulting demand supports economic activity that might otherwise contract due to displacement-driven unemployment. The historical record provides additional reassurance. Each previous wave of workweek reduction was accompanied by predictions of economic catastrophe that failed to materialize. The economies that implemented 40-hour weeks did not collapse, they prospered. While past performance does not guarantee future outcomes, the pattern suggests that concerns about feasibility should be weighed against substantial evidence of successful adaptation. #implementation timing and sequencing. Questions about implementation timing present genuine challenges. Moving too quickly risks disruption that could undermine political support for the policy. Moving too slowly allows displacement effects to materialize before protections are in place. Optimal sequencing requires balancing these considerations while maintaining flexibility to adjust as circumstances evolve. Several principles should guide timing decisions. Begin early. The strongest argument for early action is that adjustments are easier to implement before crisis conditions materialize. Waiting until mass displacement is underway will make policy intervention more difficult politically and economically. Establishing a framework now, even if initial reductions are modest, creates institutional infrastructure for more substantial adjustments as warranted. Announced trajectories. Predictability supports adjustment. If firms and workers know that the standard workweek will decrease on a specified schedule, they can plan accordingly. Surprise disruptions are more damaging than anticipated transitions. Build-in flexibility. Rigid schedules may prove inappropriate as conditions evolve in unpredictable ways. Policy frameworks should include mechanisms for adjustment, accelerating reductions if displacement proceeds rapidly, slowing them if adaptation proves more challenging than anticipated. Monitor and evaluate. Systematic data collection and evaluation should accompany implementation, generating evidence about effects and informing ongoing policy refinement. Political economy considerations. Perhaps the most significant obstacles to workweek reduction are political rather than economic. Employer organizations have historically opposed working time regulations, viewing them as constraints on managerial prerogatives and threats to profitability. Building political coalitions capable of enacting and sustaining workweek reduction policies requires overcoming these opposition forces. Several factors may create more favorable conditions for workweek reduction than historical experience might suggest. Changing worker preferences. Survey evidence indicates that substantial majorities of workers express preference for shorter working hours, particularly in the aftermath of pandemic-era disruptions to work patterns. Political movements that articulate reduced working time as an achievable aspiration may find receptive audiences. Employer experimentation. Some employers have voluntarily experimented with 4-day workweeks, often reporting positive results in terms of productivity, retention, and worker satisfaction. While these experiments remain limited, they provide proof of concept and may shift employer attitudes. Economic anxiety. Widespread concern about AI-driven displacement may create political openings for policy responses that offer protection and stability. Framing workweek reduction as a mechanism for shared prosperity in an age of automation may resonate with constituencies anxious about technological change. Generational shifts. Younger workers often express different orientations toward work-life balance than previous generations, potentially providing constituency for policies that prioritize time over income maximization. Building successful political coalitions will require clear articulation of workweek reduction as economic policy rather than lifestyle preference, a necessary adjustment to technological change rather than a concession to worker demands. The framing matters for political reception and for the durability of policy once enacted. ## Towards sustainable automation. Work time reduction as economic infrastructure. ## Reframing the relationship between work and technology. The argument developed in this article calls for a fundamental reframing of the relationship between technological progress and human work. The dominant conception treats technology as a force that either creates or destroys jobs, with policy responses oriented toward education and training to help workers compete for positions in automated economies. This framing accepts as fixed the amount of work expected from each employed worker, asking only who will fill available positions. A work time reduction framework proceeds from different premises. It recognizes that the total amount of labor socially necessary is not fixed but responds to technological development. If AI reduces the labor required to produce goods and services, society faces a choice: concentrate remaining work among a smaller number of workers while others experience unemployment, or distribute available work more broadly by reducing the hours expected of each worker. The first path leads toward inequality, instability, and the contradiction of productivity gains benefiting few while costs fall on many. The second offers a sustainable accommodation between technological capability and human flourishing. From this perspective, work time reduction is not a luxury to be enjoyed once other problems are solved, it is itself a solution to the problem of technological labor displacement. Reduced working hours should be understood as economic infrastructure, as essential to a functioning AI-era economy as transportation networks or communication systems. Just as physical infrastructure enables productive activity, working time infrastructure shapes how productivity gains are distributed across society. ## The stakes of inaction. The stakes of policy inaction are substantial. If AI capabilities continue advancing while working time norms remain frozen at 20th century levels, the likely outcomes include volatile labor markets workers experiencing recurring displacement as automation proceeds unevenly across sectors and occupations, with periods of unemployment, underemployment, and precarious reattachment to the labor force. Widening inequality productivity gains accruing to capital owners and highly compensated workers who retain positions, while displaced workers compete for diminishing opportunities in sectors not yet automated. Demand-side instability consumer spending power eroded by unemployment and wage pressure, generating recessionary dynamics that feed back into reduced investment and further displacement. Social and political instability economic insecurity generating political volatility, with displaced workers susceptible to appeals from movements that promise protection through exclusion rather than shared prosperity. These outcomes are not inevitable. They represent the trajectory that emerges from current trends in the absence of policy intervention. Recognizing that trajectory should motivate action to alter it before consequences become entrenched. ## A vision of shared prosperity. The alternative, the destination that work time reduction policy seeks, is a society in which technological progress generates broadly shared benefits. In this vision, AI-driven productivity gains translate into both material abundance and expanded time for activities beyond paid employment, family, community, creativity, civic engagement, and rest. Workers experience technological change not as a threat but as an opportunity for improved quality of life. This vision is not utopian in the sense of being unrealizable. It describes the direction toward which advanced economies have moved for centuries, as productivity gains have been progressively translated into reduced working time alongside material improvement. The 40-hour week represented one milestone in this trajectory. Further reductions represent its continuation. What the vision requires is the same deliberate policy intervention that previous transitions required. Markets alone will not generate work time reduction in response to AI productivity gains, for the same reasons they did not generate earlier reductions without labor organizing, employer initiative, and government regulation. The institutional innovation that enabled past transitions must be renewed and adapted for present circumstances. ## Conclusion. The emergence of artificial intelligence as a transformative economic force raises fundamental questions about the future of work and the distribution of technological gains. This article has argued that current patterns of AI-justified workforce reductions are driven less by genuine technological substitution than by managerial short-termism and misaligned executive incentives. Companies are proceeding with layoffs in advance of AI capabilities, stretching remaining workers while creating fragility and degraded capacity. The pattern threatens a self-undermining dynamic in which labor displacement erodes the consumer demand on which corporate profits depend. The sustainable response to AI-driven labor displacement involves adjusting labor supply through reduced working hours. If artificial intelligence reduces the total labor required to produce goods and services, the choice is between concentrating remaining work among fewer workers while others face unemployment, or distributing available work broadly through shorter workweeks. The latter path preserves employment, maintains consumer demand, and ensures that productivity gains benefit society as a whole. Historical precedent demonstrates that workweek reduction is both feasible and compatible with economic prosperity. The transition from 6-day to 5-day weeks and from 60-hour to 40-hour weeks accompanied substantial economic growth and helped constitute the consumer economies of the 20th century. Similar adjustments are appropriate responses to AI-era automation. Public policy must play the central role, since market mechanisms cannot generate workweek reduction in the face of collective action problems and competitive pressures. A policy framework should include graduated reduction of standard hours, income maintenance through the transition, incentives for employer compliance, and attention to international coordination. The specific mechanisms can be refined through experience, but the direction of policy should be established now, before AI-driven displacement generates crisis conditions that make adjustment more difficult. It is time to treat reduced working time not as a lifestyle preference or utopian aspiration but as necessary economic infrastructure for an AI-transformed labor market. The technologies being deployed across the economy will continue advancing. The question is whether societies will adapt their institutions to ensure that technological progress serves human flourishing or allow market dynamics to generate displacement, inequality, and instability. Proactive policy intervention represents the prudent course, and the opportunity to demonstrate that artificial intelligence can strengthen rather than undermine the foundations of shared prosperity. The transition will not be simple, and legitimate disagreements will arise about timing, magnitude, and implementation mechanisms. However, the alternative, continuing to treat working time norms as immutable while automation reshapes labor markets, invites outcomes that impose substantial costs on workers, families, and the broader social fabric. Avoiding those outcomes requires acting now to establish the policy frameworks that will enable sustainable accommodation between human work and artificial intelligence. The cost of inaction will ultimately be borne by those least able to afford it. The benefits of action will be shared broadly. That calculus should guide the choices ahead.